Russia's fifth-generation stealth fighter, which has been stuck in limbo amid cost overruns, Western sanctions and geopolitical bottlenecks. International sanctions have severely hampered Russia's advanced aircraft development programs.
The ongoing war in Ukraine is consuming the lion's share of Moscow's attention and resources. Kremlin leader Vladimir Putin is facing a tragedy in the management of the Russian military. The Russian Air Force in particular is performing poorly at the most critical juncture of the war. Russia lost 369 airplanes and 329 helicopters during the invasion of Ukraine. These losses wiped out 10% of the Russian Air Force. Ukraine has had some successes against Russia's Air Force, known as the VKS. These included shooting down at least 2 Russian A-50 mainstay command and control aircraft. According to Ukrainian intelligence, 3 of the 7 Russian A-50s are undergoing maintenance and modernization. While Russian aircraft have generally adapted to Ukrainian air defenses, most of which are provided by the West, by staying out of the conflict zone, such losses show that Putin's aircraft have not reached sufficient capability and are still powerless against NATO. On the other hand, US-made F-16s, which provide more capability to the Ukrainian Air Force, are seen as the most important factor that will cause the Russian Air Force to suffer more losses in the future. The most important proof of this was the first victory of the F-16s on the battlefield. On October 12th, rumours surfaced on social media platforms that a Russian Su-34 fighter jet had been shot down by a Ukrainian F-16. First shared by pro-Russian military bloggers, the allegations quickly gained traction and fueled an intense debate among both Russian and Ukrainian social media users. The loss of the $40 million Su-34 to the US-made F-16 has led to a renewed questioning of the Russian aerospace and air force. In the wake of this loss, the focus has turned to how many such aircraft remain in the Russian Air Force. According to data provided by Ukrainian military intelligence, Russia has about 100 older Su-35 fighter jets, more than 100 Su-34 fighter bombers, and 7 A-50 early warning and control aircraft as of March. It is estimated that 10 Su-34 fighter jets and 2 Su-35 fighter jets were eliminated. This figure is quite successful for Ukraine, because such aircraft are worth millions of dollars. What about the Su-57s that Russia speaks so highly of? These jets are used by the RU's Air Force, perhaps as a low-cost alternative to advanced stealth jets such as the American F-22 Raptor and F-35 Lightning II. But in recent days, an incredible scandal has emerged about the Su-57s. Now, we will discover what happened to this jet. But first, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and like our content. For a long time, Russia has been aiming to make its mark on the world aviation scene with the Su-75 Checkmate project. This aircraft was promoted as the 5th-generation fighter jet of the Putin administration and presented as the new star of Russian defense exports. However, recent reports circulating on social media, in defense circles, and especially in the British media, suggest that the Su-75 may be consigned to the dust shelves of history without ever flying. In reality, it was touted as a miracle that would save the Russian economy in the long run. Now, however, there is growing speculation that the Checkmate may never take off. Some experts argue that the project has failed to make any tangible progress other than a massive publicity stunt, and that it will never even get close to the production line in practice due to Russia's financial bottleneck and Western sanctions. On social media, the phrase "Putin's dream has failed" is frequently used, while China, the United States, and the United Kingdom have completely overtaken Russia in their 6th-generation aircraft efforts. Moreover, the Russian economy is struggling to find the necessary funds for defense projects, as it has been plagued by increasingly severe financial sanctions since the Ukraine crisis. Perhaps the Su-75 is becoming a symbol of disappointment rather than Russia's export savior. In the Su-57's origin story, the Russians were at least more hopeful. When Russia first showed a mock-up of the Su-75 to the public in mid-2021, it claimed it would produce a cheap and lightweight 5th-generation fighter. Russian officials told defense media that it would be able to do the same jobs at a much lower cost than the F-35. At the time, Moscow's big expectation was to sell the Su-75 in significant quantities in the global market, particularly in Africa and the Middle East. Because the Su-57 project failed to achieve the desired export success due to production difficulties and logistical problems, it became inevitable to turn to a new low-cost model. The name Checkmate reflected the message that Russia would checkmate the West with this move. Today, however, expert analysis paints a completely different picture. Paper designs and flashy promotions aside, actual production capacity is non-existent. Foreign buyers are almost non-existent, and the Kremlin is far from having the resources to finance the project. Russia's hopes are pinned on this aircraft, which is allegedly being marketed with promises of low radar signature, high maneuverability, advanced avionics, and readiness for unmanned operations. However, the prototype flight date, which has been repeatedly postponed, has been pushed back to the end of 2024, mid-2025, 2026, and has been dragged into uncertainty. Many independent analysts criticise that big words have been spoken, but there is still no flying prototype. According to some defence blogs, the project team has not even made a complete engine selection yet. The engine issue is one of the sensitive points of Russian fighter jets. Even the Su-57 lacked new generation engines. Now, it is argued that a special engine should be developed for a lighter platform like the Su-75. But in the end, there is no concrete output. Analysts who say the Su-75 may never take off cite these reasons: lack of technology, engine uncertainty, software inadequacy, and, of course, the financial gap. This may be why the Su-75, considered the aircraft of the future, has been relegated to the bottom of the list. Some commentators argue that Russia can barely produce even the Su-57 and has difficulty producing even 10 of them a year. On the other hand, there are similar supply problems for the cheaper version of the Su-75. Sanctions have prevented Western electronics and components from arriving. He paints an even bleaker picture by saying that it is uncertain whether they will get support from China. But this very issue of technical assistance from China raises an interesting point. Beijing has its own fifth-generation J-20 fighter, is making progress on projects like the J-31, and may prefer to compete rather than help Russia. Some say that China has overtaken Russia rather than buying from Russia. So it is not easy for the Su-75 to find a foreign partner. In the past, the situation was a bit different. Russia's arms market was based on many states from the Middle East to Asia. Platforms such as the Su-27 and its derivatives and the MiG-29 sold well. But in recent years, with a story similar to Turkey's S-400, those who want to buy Russian products are looking to the US or European sanctions. A country looking for a fifth-generation aircraft might be interested in the US F-35 or Europe's future sixth-generation projects, or China's J-31 variant, but not Russia's Checkmate, which cannot even fly as a prototype. On social media, the question who will buy the Su-75 is often answered with nobody. For example, India was once a partner in the Su-57 project, but then walked away on the grounds of low technology transfer and high cost. Now, a similar disappointment may be experienced for the Su-75. Countries in the Middle East also prefer US or French technology. Under these circumstances, the dream that Russia will have a big export boom has been dashed. Even the question, will a few African or South American states buy it, is answered with, how will they buy it? There are no airplanes, according to expert forecasts. Another challenge of the Su-57 project is developing stealth technology. Since Soviet times, the Russian defense industry has focused on high maneuver and speed. Stealth has been attempted with the Su-57, but the existing prototypes do not offer full saturation stealth. The Su-75 promises low radar signature, but many Western analysts say Russia is behind in this area, getting close to the low radar cross-section achieved by the F-35 and F-22 requires complex materials, science, and modern manufacturing techniques. Russia, under sanctions, may also fall short in this area. Checkmate looks good on the exhibition stand, but it will fall behind in radar contrast, comments are made on social media. Moreover, it is not realistic for the shattered Russian technology equipment supply chain to work stably in such an ambitious project. So why is this a big disappointment for Putin? Because before Russia was under Western sanctions over the Ukraine war, it was earning foreign currency through arms exports and energy sales. The export of next-generation fighter jets was seen as a potential future source of income, perhaps worth $50 to $100 billion. When the Su-57 project failed to live up to expectations, they hoped to create new markets with the lighter and cheaper Su-75. But the Ukraine war has damaged Russia's international image, shaken confidence in its military technology, broken supply chains, and put many countries at risk of Western sanctions if they buy from Russia. When all these factors are added up, it is almost impossible to find a customer for the Su-75. Unless sanctions relief or an end to the war materialises in the short term, the project is doomed to remain on paper. Although some news reports suggest that Russia may be able to develop the aircraft on the domestic market, it is extremely difficult to find domestic financing in such an economic crisis. There are those who say it could be postponed until the 2030s, but no one is sure. Meanwhile, actors such as China, the US and the UK are rapidly advancing their sixth-generation aircraft programs. Examples such as the US B-21 bomber project, the NGAD initiative, the UK's next-generation jet developed with Japan and Italy under the name GCAP, are all much more advanced and funded projects. On social media, there is criticism that the world is talking about the sixth generation before Russia has even properly moved to the fifth generation. On the contrary, the Su-75, dubbed Checkmate, is ridiculed by competitors as a work that is no more than a pawn. Russia has perhaps lost its Soviet-era aviation heritage. There are no new cadres, no new technology, no capital, experts say. So from every point of view, there is a very real danger that the Su-75 project will be nothing more than hollow propaganda. A big disappointment for Putin, the newspaper's headline, as he has repeatedly used the rhetoric of "we will overtake the West" at mock-up demonstrations. Given all these facts, the Su-75 Checkmate will never fly is no longer an exaggerated prediction. The moment Russia loses its economic and technical capability in practice, such prestige projects cannot be underwritten, defence writers say. In addition, technology restrictions imposed by the US and EU cut off access to sensitive electronic and software components. The modern avionics and sensors of a fighter jet like the Su-75 may be dependent on Western or Asian parts. Right now, it is too costly and time-consuming for Russia to create these supply lines. The budget deficit caused by the war and the shift of law enforcement and military spending to emergency areas have severely constrained R&D funds. This reinforces the idea that, like many domestic projects, the Su-75 will remain on the shelf. After all, if Russia continues this program for another 10 years, maybe it will fly a prototype. But by then, the world will be talking about the sixth or even seventh generation aircraft, is one of the most frequently repeated comments in the British media. For Russia, this is not only a technological disappointment, but also a lost economic opportunity. Selling new aircraft on the export market could have been one of the key items feeding the country's foreign exchange reserves. Now potential buyers will turn their eyes to countries like the US, China, Europe, and even South Korea. Russia has previously held some talks with countries such as India or Algeria, but has not seen any concrete demand for this project. Although some news reports say that the UAE was interested at one point, the UAE's interest may have cooled after Russia's aggression in Ukraine. All in all, the Checkmate idea may have been a glamorous PR campaign, but it is far from being Putin's greatest saviour project. Now it is being suggested that the Su-57 is just an empty mock-up. Some analysts are not taking the Su-75 seriously, arguing that such marketing tactics are an old Russian habit of trying to gain a foothold at military exhibitions. In fact, those interested in Russian aviation Remember Sukhoi's early experiments with the Su-47 Berkut or the MiG's 1.44 project? Some of them remained as awe-inspiring product launches, and even the flying prototypes never made it to full production. The Su-75 could be the last in this tradition. There are already a number of problems limiting production capability in cities like Ryazan and Novosibirsk, not to mention the logistical problems of the Ukraine crisis. When all this comes together, reports of goodbye to the Checkmate dream are multiplying. This means that Russian aviation is in decline in the Putin era. Commentators say, while the US and the UK are now rapidly moving to the 6th generation, Russia is stumbling even in the 5th generation. China, on the other hand, is taking the lead in this field with the J-20. In this way, Russia is moving away from its Cold War identity as a Soviet legend and towards examples of failed launches in aviation. Considering the losses of aircraft and difficulties against Western weapons in the Ukrainian theatre, it can be said that Russia's military reputation has suffered a serious blow. All of this is summarised in the headline, Putin's hope for his biggest source of income is in the dark. This is because the Russian leader had hoped to alleviate his economic woes with the profits from arms exports. But when the Su-75 is no longer there at all, it is a double blow, meaning a loss of prestige and money. From the outside, Western media and social platforms portray a scenario of competition that leaves Russia completely behind. It is often emphasized that China, the US, the UK, and the EU bloc have advanced in air technologies, while Russia, despite calling itself a checkmate, is the one who is on the checkmate side. Checkmate is a fancy marketing name, but it has become the real checkmate for Russia's ambition. Some ironic messages read, this narrative reinforces that the project is a makeshift venture that will never fly, perhaps never even reach the production line. Of course, it will never fly may be an exaggeration, and Russia may be able to make a demonstration flight with a limited prototype. But talking about full production and export success seems rather utopian under current conditions. Defense analysts say that Russia cannot afford such a financial burden. Its priority is to sustain its military, which has been worn out in the Ukrainian theatre. At the same time, the domestic opposition may ask why we are burying our money in garbage projects. As long as sanctions remain in place, Russia cannot sell technology to the Western market or buy supplies there. Even if it looks to China for support, Beijing will not lend Russia a helping hand, perhaps preferably because it wants to market its own planes. Checkmate therefore remains in a locked-in position. After all, Beijing plans to fill the low-cost 5th-generation market by developing its own J-31 project, and it is illogical for it to allow Russia to fill the gap. As such, the Su-75 Checkmate, Putin's magnum opus, is increasingly becoming a military fairy tale. Some mock it as Russia's naked Tsar story. However, in the introduction in 2021, there was a commitment for the first flight in the next few years and mass production between 2024 and 2025. Now, as we enter 2025, there is no clear prototype, no news about the production facility, and engine and avionics development is not even on the table. Again, the silence of Russian officials raises the question of whether the project has been effectively shelved. Even the state media has refrained from covering the issue. The plane will be ready soon is the current news, but the date is constantly pushed back. Defence circles, on the other hand, say that despite all this PR, zero concrete progress speaks for itself. Overall, the Su-75 Checkmate project represents the gap between the ambitions of the Russian defence industry and its reality. Initially hyped as Putin's biggest source of income, the project is now, at worst, on the verge of being cancelled altogether. With the resources spent by Russia in the Ukraine war, the sanctions and the technology embargo, it ironically turns out that Checkmate is the real loser. Russian aviation seems to be looking for the glory of the MiG and Sukhoi of the 1990s. Therefore, the 5th-generation fighter jet that will never fly is not an exaggeration. It is very close to the truth. Some say that maybe a prototype will take to the runway for a propaganda show, but there will be no mass production. Ultimately, however, its absence from the global defence market will set Russia back in terms of deterrence and export prestige. Thank you for watching.